Hi, this is Ms. Granquist again. Welcome to the second part of your language lecture. Hope that you all have listened to the first part, first. And then following this, there will be a third part, and please make sure that you go through all of them. Okay. So looking at language families. So a language family is a large group of similar languages and language groups that come from the same root. So the Indo-European language family refers to a bunch of languages that all come from the same root. The Indo-European family is the largest and most widespread in terms of geographical area as well as in terms of numbers of speakers. It is divided into a variety of subfamilies: Romance, Slavic, Germanic, etc. These just refer to groups of similar languages. So then the Romance subfamily would be divided into a bunch of different Romance languages: Spanish, French, Romanian. The Germanic language group would be divided into a number of languages: German, Swiss, English, etc., and so on for each of these subfamilies. Linguistic historians basically look at these languages and look at where they developed from by tracing sound shifts and vocabulary similarities. A sound shift would be when a sound just basically shifts. So a t sound might become a d sound or a th sound. That would be a language shift or a sound shift for a language. These kinds of shifts come out of isolation. So language divergence, like any other cultural trait, is going to come out of isolation. Convergence then comes through interaction. So one of the things that we can see when we're looking at these languages and tracing languages back historically is that linguistic historians will look for similarities in words that everyone would have known. So everyone would have had some sort of word to describe familial relationships: mother, father, sister, brother. Everyone would have had some sort of word to describe physical features. So those are the most common words they use to trace things back. Not everyone would have necessarily had a word to indicate a particular kind of animal, because those animals may not have existed everywhere. So penguin, probably not a good word to use to trace backwards, but mother is. And you can see at the bottom here, in our Indo-European languages, all the different variations of mother, and whether you can pronounce them or not, you can definitely see that they share a great deal in common. Okay, so take a look here at our language family tree here and see if you can find English. We are in the Germanic branch, if that is going to help you discover where English is. So looking at this, then, English developed out of Western Germanic. All right, that means at some point all of the people who spoke Flemish, Dutch, Low German, High German, Frisian, and English, their ancestors at some point were all speaking this Western Germanic language. All right, and then we also have this Northern Germanic Scandinavian tongue: Danish, Swedish, Icelandic, Norwegian, etc., and this other little branch, Gothic. Okay, so take all of those back, and at some point, the ancestors of all of those people were speaking something called Proto-Germanic. All right, okay, that makes sense, and then isolation, of course, is going to separate that Proto-Germanic into various branches, and then later into all of these languages. So let's take that even further back. Keep going back down the tree. So we go back down Proto-Germanic, and we end up with Balto-Slavo-Germanic. Okay, so that means that at some point there were a group of people speaking this Balto-Slavo-Germanic language, and then isolation caused them to split into Proto-Germanic and Balto-Slavic, which Balto-Slavic then split into Baltic and Slavic, and so on and so on. So it makes sense then to take it all the way back and say, okay, at some point, the people who today are speaking some sort of Anatolian, the people who are speaking some sort of Celtic, so the people who are speaking Balto-Slavo-Germanic, the people who are speaking Ariano, Greco, Armenic, etc., all of these people, all of their ancestors were speaking the same language, and we call that Proto-Indo-European. Now, there is no written record of this Proto-Indo-European language. The only way they've been able to figure this out is to go back through reconstruction. Like we were talking about before, looking at similarities between languages in terms of vocabulary they would have had in common. And sounds that they have in common. And so this mainly has come out of studying the languages of ancient Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin, and comparing the similarities between those languages to attempt to create some sense of what this Proto-Indo-European language would be. Okay, so if you want to, you can go on the side here, and there is an article that has some links or some links within it to what Proto-Indo-European might have sounded like, so you may find that fun. And then there's another kind of cool Proto-Indo-European site you can go look at below that, and so those may be fun for you to explore. One of the interesting things as we look at this, the languages of northern India are on here. So if you see our Indic branch on here, but the languages of southern India are not. They do not belong to this Proto-Indo-European language family. They are on a different family. Now, if you take a look down here at the very bottom, I would like to point out that our little Proto-Indo-European language is a very small portion of this really big tree of language. All right, so that's kind of an important thing to keep in mind. Okay, so our Indo-European diffusion. Our earliest speakers came from southern and southeastern Turkey, which we call Anatolia, around 8,000 or 9,000 years ago. By the way, CA dot means circa, and that means around. And it went from there west and north into Europe. And there's two main theories of how this happened. The first one is the agricultural theory, and this says basically that languages spread with the spread of agriculture coming out of these same hearth areas, and that as people adopted agriculture, they adopted the language that went with it. The other main theory about this is the conquest theory. For this, we move the hearth a little bit northward into modern Ukraine, and they say that the people there were able to conquer other areas around 8,000 or 9,000 years ago because they had better technology, the wheel, horses, etc., and thus they were able to move quickly through Europe and spread their language through conquest instead. So both theories are fairly well accepted, and no one really knows for sure which one it was. Of course, later language diffusion is going to occur with the spread of great political empires. Latin spreads through the Roman Empire. English spreads through, of course, the British colonization, Russian through the creation of the Russian Empire. And when we look at these conquerors' languages, what we're going to see is that they spread hierarchically from one important place to another important place, or from important individuals to a number of other important individuals. And so that kind of diffusion is hierarchical as opposed to contagious. So if we go back to our theories of movement from Anatolia, of course, our conquest theory is going to deal with it moving hierarchically. Our spread of agriculture theory is going to deal with it moving contagiously. Okay, on this site you can see the movement of various language families from their hearths. All right, so this is looking at the agricultural theory from Turkey on through Europe and into Asia as well at various times. You can look at the Austronesian group coming out of Southeastern Asia. You can look at the Afro-Asiatic source coming out of that little area of land from the Fertile Crescent. You can look at the Niger-Congo source in Eastern Africa. In Western Africa, spreading downward from there. And so these are all old hearths of of language, and you can see their spread from there. Okay, this is just another way of looking at the language tree, and it just brings in more groups than we saw on our first one. So you can see our Afro-Asiatic group leading to the Semitic and Hamitic languages, as well as some others. You can look at Dravidian languages, our languages of southern India. You can look at the Uralic and Altaic languages, Japanese, Korean, Austronesian, Austroasiatic, Caucasian, Amerindian, the Niger-Congo, the Nilo-Saharan, and the Sino-Tibetan. The Sino-Tibetan is the next largest language family and has, I think, Mandarin is the language with the largest group speaking it. Okay, so looking at our other major language families, the Sino-Tibetan is the second largest language family and has around 403 languages spoken in it. It goes throughout most of China and Southeast Asia. And here we get into some interesting things because we see often we refer to Mandarin and Cantonese and some other languages in this area as well as being dialects of Chinese. However, these are not mutually intelligible in the way that we discussed earlier. So our dialects we assume to be mutually intelligible, all right, and then languages are not. So Mandarin and Cantonese are not, when you speak them, mutually intelligible. However, both use the same writing. And so this becomes an interesting discussion as to whether these are separate languages or just dialects of a language. The Afro-Asiatic family is also very widespread. The Semitic languages come out of the Fertile Crescent and moved across the northern half of Africa. Of these, Arabic is the most widespread, although Hebrew is the oldest. The expansion of Islam greatly increased the expansion of the Semitic languages and the number of speakers of it, but it has at the same time then decreased the number of speakers of the Hamitic languages, which used to be throughout most of Africa. Another interesting thing coming out of here is Hebrew used to be a dead language, and it did not have any people who spoke it as their mother tongue. However, the country of Israel chose Hebrew to be its official language, and so the language has now been revived. Okay, so here again we're going to see just some areas of the world where different languages are spoken. So we have our Indo-European family, we have our various native families of language, which you can see here in the brown parts of the map. Going to this side, you can see there's a variety of more languages. We have in northern South Asia, we have mainly our Indo-European languages. In the southern part, we have mainly our Dravidian languages. Of course, Sri Lanka is going to have some of both, and so that's kind of interesting. And this is just breaking it down then for Europe, looking at the variety of European languages that we see here. Interestingly enough, although this is Europe, Europe is not fully Indo-European in its languages. There's some interesting things we can look at here in terms of isolation. So if you look at the border between Spain and France, and there's that little brown area with the Basque language. So the Basque language, we don't know where it came from. All right, we don't know what its language family is. We don't know, the people who spoke it originally. Did they move there? How did this little isolated language get there? So it is called a language isolate, and it does not share commonalities of vocabulary or grammatical structure with any of the other Indo-European languages. We also have Magyar here in the area where Hungary is. You can see that. You go where Serbo-Croatian, Romanian, etc. are, and then look right above that and you see the Magyar. And its most closely linked to Finnish, and yet you can see there's a great deal of distance between the Magyar language and the Finnish language. So how did that kind of isolation happen? And so it's just an interesting thing to think about historically. How did this language development occur? So when we start looking for the first language, okay, so why would we look for the first language? Well, at some point when our first humans are created, they probably all spoke the same language because, well, there weren't that many of them. And this is called the language. And so people are looking to try to figure out, okay, what language did the very first humans speak? And there are a lot of controversies over this. These theories are not nearly as widely accepted as the theories about Proto-Indo-European. So Nostratic is one of the macro language families they're looking at. It is assumed to be the ancestral speech of the Middle East, and is thought to be the ancestor to 9 modern language families: Indo-European, Uralic, Altaic, Dravidian, Afroasiatic, Kartvelian, etc. They have, through language reconstruction, remember looking back at that similarity in vocabulary and that similarity in sound, created a 500-word dictionary for this Nostratic language. Contemporary to the Nostratic language would be the Dene-Caucasian language. And this would have led to Sino-Tibetan, Basque, and Native American. And so, again, through language reconstruction, they've done this. So it's another kind of interesting phenomena that we are dealing with in language is this historical lingualism, where they are trying to rediscover what earlier languages would have sounded like. Okay, so this ends our lecture for today, and I will see you on Language Part 3. Have a good evening.